Okay, this is part two. We're going to talk about validity, and that is what the test measures. Validity is probably the most important characteristic of a test or other assessment technique. Without good validity, all else is lost. A test may be perfectly reliable and have impeccable norms, but it is not valid. If it is not valid, it is of no use. So a test can be reliable and not be valid, but it can't be valid and not be reliable. So if it's valid, it's reliable. All right? You can have reliability all day long. It can give consistent results, but still not measure what you intended for it to measure. But validity is the most important thing. All right? When we're talking about validity, we're talking about the validity of a test score, not of the actual test. So to what degree is the assessment valid for awarding a grade based on some knowledge of the subject matter? So to what extent, how valid is that score for being able to say they've mastered what you intended for them to master through that assessment? Okay? With validity, you can have construct underrepresentation and construct irrelevance. Construct underrepresentation is when you have something that is not covered on the test. That construct would be underrepresented. If you have construct irrelevance, that would be that something's on the assessment that is irrelevant to the standards or the objectives or what it is you intended to measure. When we're talking about validity, the basic issue is providing evidence that the scores on a test are indicative of the trait or construct of interest. Validity addresses how well an assessment technique provides useful information about the target being the construct. For example, knowledge of whole numbers, proficiency in math. So that target would be math. If it was knowledge of whole numbers would be the target. Whatever it is you're trying to measure. There's a few different categories when you talk about validity. You have content validity, you have criterion-related validity, and we're going to talk about those. Okay, so you also have another issue called face validity. And you've heard the old saying, don't take it for face value, make sure that it is what it is. And so that's the same thing with tests. Whether a test looks like it measures the target is a different story than whether it actually does. So never substitute face validity for that empirical validity, whether or not it actually is valid. When we talk about content validity, we've talked about this before when we were talking about how to build your test blueprints, okay, and making sure that your test was valid. So one way to ensure that you have content validity is building those test blueprints. So the definition for content validity is the relationship between content of a test and some well-defined domain of knowledge or behavior. There must be a good match between the content of the test and the content of the domain. So between the test and whatever it is you're trying to measure. Okay? In order to do that, you're going to use your test blueprint along with Bloom's taxonomy. So those two allow you, that's the process of establishing content validity begins with careful definition of the content to be covered. So what is it that you want to cover? What is it that you want to measure? That results in your table of blueprint. So that layout is very important in helping you make sure you have content validity in your assessments. How do you build content validity into an assessment? You start with clear specification of the content to be covered, and then you build the assessment to match the blueprint. How do we check content validity with an existing test? First of all, you have to have a clear definition of what is it that you're measuring or covering, and then you match the items on the test to the definition of what's to be covered. So, for example, if you already have a test that's made and a former teacher gives you that test, you can check off item by item which objective it matches and make sure that every item on that test has been covered. If not, then you're going to figure out whether you have the construct underrepresentation or construct irrelevance. Okay? The next thing about content validity is instructional validity. This is a special application of content validity. It asks whether or not the content has actually been taught. What's their opportunity to learn? Also known as curricular validity. It applies primarily to educational achievement tests. So for instance, a lot of times you'll take the SAT, your students will, and they'll say, well, we didn't cover that. Or another example is the high school graduation exam. Students are allowed to take it 9th grade, 10th grade, and there may be some things on there that they have not yet covered. That would be an example of it would not have instructional validity because they have not taught that yet. Okay? Criterion-related validity is the other type of validity. Definition for criterion-related validity: establishing the relationship between performance of the test and on some other criterion that is taken as an important indicator of the construct of interest. Construct meaning target. What is it that you're trying to measure? So basically you're looking at, if I have two assessments, say the SAT and the LSAT, which is what you're going to be doing in your standardized test profile in your last assignment. So what they do is they give an achievement test along with an ability test, and they try to establish some relationship between how you're performing on the achievement test and how you're performing on your ability test. So for example, you may take an example on how the kids are naming letters in the classroom and how they perform on the dibbles, with how they're, if they can identify every letter in the classroom, can they identify every letter and sound on the dibbles? You look for that relationship between those, okay? And that's called an aptitude achievement discrepancy. So what they're capable of learning and what they're actually learning. So you're looking for that relationship. There's two types of criterion-related validity. One is predictive validity and one is concurrent validity. The one I just mentioned with the dibbles and how they're performing in the classroom would be an example of concurrent, and that is checking an agreement between test performance and current status on some other variable. So how are they performing in the class and how did they perform on the dibbles? Can you make that connection? The other is predictive validity, and that is the test aims to predict some status on some criterion that will be attained in the future. The perfect example is they use ACT scores to predict first-year college GPA. That's usually what it's for, is research-based. You can use how well they perform on the dibbles to how well they will be reading in the first grade. You could do things like that. So you can do in class to see how you can predict how they will perform, or year to year how they will perform. And that's a little bit about validity. So that should give you an idea of what you're talking about, knowing what that validity stands for and making sure that your assessments are valid.